Have you ever had a conversation that seemed completely normal, but somehow ended with you feeling guilty, angry, or responsible for something you never agreed to? Maybe someone complained about a problem. You tried to help, and somehow you became the villain. Or perhaps you asked a simple question at work and suddenly found yourself defending a decision you never made. These moments can feel random, but according to psychiatrist Eric Berne, they often aren't random at all. Human beings have patterns of interaction that repeat again and again. Berne called some of these patterns games. And the strange thing about psychological games is that the people playing them may not realize they are playing. You think you're having a conversation, but underneath the conversation, something else may be happening. Someone wants reassurance. Someone wants control. Someone wants attention. Someone wants to avoid responsibility. Someone wants to prove they were right all along. And sometimes both people are unconsciously cooperating. That is what makes these games so fascinating. They can happen between partners, parents and children, friends, coworkers, managers, and even strangers. And once you learn to recognize them, ordinary conversations can suddenly look very different.
Eric Berne explored these patterns in his influential book, Games People Play, published in 1964. His central idea was surprisingly simple. People don't always interact from the same psychological position. Sometimes we behave like a parent, sometimes like an adult, sometimes like a child. These aren't simply age categories. They are different states of mind. The parent contains learned rules, judgments, instructions, and attitudes absorbed from authority figures. The child contains emotions, impulses, fears, creativity, rebellion, and old patterns of responding. The adult is different. It is the part of us that examines what is happening right now and responds based on current information. Imagine someone making a mistake at work. The parent might immediately say, "How many times do I have to tell you?" The child might think, "Nobody understands me. It's always my fault." The adult might ask, "What happened and what do we need to do next?" Same person, same situation, completely different response. And here's where things become interesting. Conversations can become surprisingly predictable depending on which psychological states are interacting.
Imagine a manager saying to an employee, "You should have known better." The employee responds, "I'm sorry, I'll try harder." On the surface, this sounds like a normal workplace conversation, but psychologically, something else may be happening. The manager is speaking from a critical parent position. The employee is responding from a child position. The interaction can continue like this for years. The manager criticizes, the employee apologizes. The manager feels powerful, the employee feels inadequate. And both people become trapped in a familiar pattern. Now imagine the same situation handled differently. The manager says, "The deadline was missed. Let's look at what caused the delay." The employee says, "The supplier changed the delivery date, and I didn't escalate it quickly enough." Now both are closer to adult communication. There is less blame and more information. This distinction matters because many conflicts aren't actually about the subject being discussed. They're about the psychological positions people occupy while discussing it. And once you understand that, you may begin noticing something uncomfortable. Sometimes the argument is not really about the argument. Think about a couple having the same fight every few weeks. One partner says, "You never listen to me." The other says, "Because you're always complaining." The first responds, "See, you don't care." The second says, "Nothing I do is ever good enough." Then both become angry. Eventually, someone apologizes, they make peace, and everything feels normal again. Until the same conversation happens next month. Why does this happen? Because the argument may be serving a psychological purpose beyond solving the stated problem. It creates familiar emotions and familiar roles. One person becomes the accuser, the other becomes the victim. Then the roles may reverse. The details change, but the pattern remains. Berne's insight was that people often repeat these patterns because they provide something psychologically satisfying, even when the result is painful. That sounds strange. Why would anyone repeatedly participate in something that makes them unhappy? Because familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar change. If you've spent years receiving attention through conflict,
This is one of the most powerful ideas in the book. People often repeat what they know, not necessarily what is good for them. Consider a person who constantly asks others for advice. Should I take this job? Should I leave my relationship? What do you think I should do? Someone gives an answer. The person then explains why the answer won't work. Another suggestion comes. Another objection follows. Eventually, everyone is frustrated. What was the real goal? Was the person genuinely looking for a solution, or were they looking for something else? Perhaps reassurance. Perhaps permission to remain where they are. Perhaps an opportunity to prove that nobody can help them. The conversation can become a psychological game. The obvious subject is the problem. The hidden reward may be attention, sympathy, or confirmation of an existing belief. This is why simply giving better advice doesn't always solve a person's problem. Sometimes the problem isn't a lack of information. It's a pattern. And if you don't recognize the pattern, you'll keep supplying solutions, while the other person keeps producing reasons why every solution is impossible. You become exhausted. They remain stuck. And both of you may wonder why nothing changes. Another important concept in Berne's framework is the idea of transactions. Every interaction can be viewed as an exchange between psychological states. A person says something, another person responds. Usually the conversation continues smoothly when the response matches the psychological direction of the first communication. But when the response comes from an unexpected state, tension can appear. Imagine a husband asking his wife, "Do you know where my keys are?" The straightforward adult response would be, "They're on the table." But imagine she responds, "Why do you always expect me to find everything for you?" Suddenly the conversation has changed. The question was about keys. The response is about resentment. Now the husband may say, "I was just asking." She says, "You're always asking." Within seconds, they're arguing about their entire relationship. The keys were never really the problem. The interaction shifted from a practical adult question into an emotional exchange. This is why some conversations escalate so quickly. One person is discussing the present event, the other is responding to an old emotional pattern. And if the first person reacts emotionally, the pattern becomes stronger.
The solution is not to become cold or robotic. It's to notice which psychological state is operating. Ask yourself, am I responding to what is actually happening right now, or am I reacting to something this situation reminds me of? That single question can interrupt a surprising number of conflicts, because your present conversation may be activating an old emotional script. Someone criticizes you, and suddenly you feel like a child being scolded. Someone becomes distant, and you immediately feel abandoned. Someone disagrees with you, and you feel the need to prove yourself. The current person may have triggered an old pattern without intending to. Your reaction may therefore be much bigger than the situation itself. This doesn't mean your feelings aren't real. It means the intensity may contain history. And once you recognize that, you gain a choice. You can respond to the person in front of you rather than automatically responding to the people from your past. That is one of the practical strengths of Berne's model. It gives you language for experiences that otherwise feel mysterious. Instead of saying, "Something is wrong with me," you can ask, "Which part of me is responding right now?"
The parent state can be especially powerful because much of it is learned before we are old enough to question it. We absorb phrases, attitudes, rules, and emotional reactions from parents, teachers, culture, and authority figures. People like us don't behave that way. Money is difficult to earn. You should always put others first. Don't trust strangers. Work comes before everything. Some of these messages are useful. Others may become outdated or unnecessarily restrictive. The challenge is that we can carry them into adulthood without realizing that they are inherited beliefs rather than objective truths. Imagine an adult who feels intense guilt whenever they rest. They may believe that relaxing is lazy. Where did that belief come from? Perhaps they grew up hearing that productive people are always busy. Now they have a successful career, but whenever they sit down, guilt appears. The adult can examine that belief and ask, is rest actually irresponsible, or is this an old rule I learned? That question creates psychological freedom. Not every rule you inherited deserves to control your adult life.
The child state is equally important because it contains more than immaturity. It includes spontaneity, curiosity, creativity, joy, playfulness, and emotional sensitivity. Think about a child discovering something fascinating for the first time. They don't need permission to be curious. They experiment, they laugh, they become completely absorbed. That part of us doesn't disappear when we grow older. It can remain a source of creativity and enthusiasm. But the child can also carry fear, insecurity, rebellion, and old emotional responses. A person may become an accomplished professional and still react like a frightened child when criticized. Another person may rebel against authority simply because authority reminds them of earlier experiences. Understanding the child, therefore, isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about recognizing when an old emotional response is driving a current decision. There is nothing wrong with feeling angry, afraid, excited, or hurt. The problem occurs when the emotion automatically takes control and the adult disappears from the conversation. Emotional awareness gives you the opportunity to feel the emotion without becoming completely controlled by it.
And then there is the adult. The adult is not emotionless. It is not robotic logic. It is the capacity to evaluate the present situation using available information. Imagine receiving a harsh message from your manager. The child may immediately think, they hate me. The parent may say, you should never make mistakes. The adult asks, what exactly did they say? What happened? What information do I have? What response would actually help? The adult doesn't deny emotion. It creates space around emotion. This is incredibly useful because modern life constantly triggers fast reactions. A message arrives. We respond immediately. Someone criticizes us. We defend ourselves. Someone ignores us. We assume the worst. Someone praises us. We immediately seek more approval. The adult slows the process down. It asks for evidence. It separates facts from interpretations. And this is where Berne's ideas become surprisingly relevant to everyday life. You don't have to diagnose everyone around you. You simply need to notice your own patterns. The more often you can shift into an adult state, the less likely you are to be pulled into repetitive psychological games.
Now let's look at why people play games in the first place. One reason is recognition. Human beings need some form of emotional acknowledgement. Berne discussed this in terms of strokes, meaning units of recognition or attention. A stroke can be positive or negative. A compliment is positive. A smile is positive. But even criticism is a form of recognition. This creates a fascinating psychological possibility. If a person has learned that negative attention is better than no attention, they may unconsciously create conflict to receive it. Think about someone who constantly starts arguments. Everyone becomes involved. People react, messages are exchanged. The person may complain that everyone is against them, yet the conflict also guarantees attention. Or think about a child who repeatedly misbehaves because every time they do, adults immediately focus on them. The behavior may continue because the attention is rewarding, even when the attention is negative. Adults can operate similarly. They may create drama because drama guarantees emotional contact. This doesn't mean they're consciously manipulating everyone. The pattern can operate automatically.
Another reason people play games is that games can protect us from vulnerability. Honest communication can be frightening. Saying, I'm afraid you'll leave me, is vulnerable. Saying, you never care about me, is easier. Asking, can you reassure me, can feel exposed. Starting an argument can feel safer. Instead of admitting fear, we express anger. Instead of saying we need affection, we complain. Instead of saying we don't know what to do, we create a problem someone else must solve. The game becomes a shield. It allows us to get an emotional result without directly asking for it.
but there is a cost. The other person responds to the surface message rather than the hidden need, so the original need remains unsatisfied. Imagine someone saying, "You never spend enough time with me." The hidden message might be, "I miss you and want to feel important to you." If the other person hears,
This is why one of the most powerful ways to break a psychological game is to say what you actually need. Instead of, "You never help me," try, "I need your help with this." Instead of, "You don't care," try, "I need reassurance right now." Instead of, "Fine, do whatever you want," try, "I disagree, and I'd like us to discuss it." Directness can feel uncomfortable because it removes the protection of the game, but it also creates the possibility of a genuine response. Now, consider how these patterns appear at work. A manager may repeatedly ask an employee, "Why can't you ever get this right?" The employee apologizes, promises improvement, and repeats the mistake. The manager gets to occupy the role of the authority who is constantly correcting. The employee gets to occupy the role of the inadequate person who is constantly failing. Both roles become familiar. The workplace becomes emotionally exhausting. But an adult-to-adult conversation would sound different. The same issue has happened 3 times. Let's identify the cause, agree on a process, and decide how we'll measure improvement. The emotional drama decreases. Responsibility becomes clearer. Now think about a different workplace pattern. An employee approaches a manager with a problem. The manager gives a solution. The employee explains why it won't work. The manager gives another solution. Another objection appears. After several rounds, the manager becomes frustrated and says, "Then why did you come to me?" This pattern can become a game if the real purpose wasn't to solve the problem. Perhaps the employee wanted reassurance, sympathy, or permission to avoid making the decision themselves. The manager unknowingly participates by repeatedly providing solutions. The more solutions they provide, the more responsibility they accept. The employee becomes dependent. The manager becomes resentful. A more useful response might be, "What options have you already considered, and which one do you recommend?" Suddenly, responsibility moves back to the person who owns the problem. This is a simple but powerful communication shift. Instead of becoming the rescuer, you invite the other person to become an adult participant. You don't abandon them. You simply refuse to take responsibility for a decision that belongs to them. This connects to one of the most recognizable psychological games, the victim-rescuer pattern. One person presents themselves as powerless. Another person rushes in to solve everything. At first, the relationship may feel wonderful. The rescuer feels needed. The victim feels supported. But over time, resentment can appear. The rescuer thinks, "Why can't they do anything themselves?" The victim thinks, "Why does the rescuer keep controlling me?" Eventually, the victim may resist the help. The rescuer becomes angry. Then the roles can reverse. The person who was rescuing becomes the victim. The former victim becomes the critic. This pattern is sometimes discussed more broadly through the concept of a drama triangle, where people can move between victim, rescuer, and persecutor roles. The important lesson is not to label people permanently. People can move between these roles depending on the situation. The practical question is, am I helping someone become more capable? Or there is another common pattern. If it weren't for you. Imagine someone saying, "I would have started my business, but my partner doesn't support me." Or, "I would exercise, but my job takes all my time." Or, "I would have succeeded, but my family didn't encourage me." Sometimes these statements are completely understandable. Real obstacles exist. But when a person repeatedly uses another person as the permanent explanation for every unfulfilled goal, something else may be happening. Responsibility is being transferred outward. The psychological benefit is that failure becomes less painful because the person doesn't have to confront their own choices. The cost is enormous. If someone else is always responsible for your life, you also give that person control over your life. The adult response is different. It asks, what is within my control? Maybe the partner is genuinely unsupportive. Maybe the job really is demanding. Maybe the circumstances are difficult. But there may still be choices. Setting boundaries, changing the job, adjusting the goal, asking for help, delaying the plan, or accepting the trade-off consciously. Responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything. It means identifying where your agency begins.
Another powerful game is the search for flaws. Someone asks for advice, receives it, and then immediately finds a problem with every suggestion. Yes, but that won't work. Yes, but I already tried that. Yes, but my situation is different. Soon, the conversation becomes a competition to prove that no solution exists. The person may not be looking for a solution at all. They may be looking for confirmation that their situation is uniquely impossible. If you recognize this pattern, don't become frustrated trying to produce the perfect answer. Instead, ask a different question. What outcome do you actually want? Or what would you be willing to change? Those questions move the conversation away from endless objections and toward responsibility. This is a broader lesson from Berne's work. Pay attention not only to what people say, but to what happens repeatedly after they say it. A single complaint may mean nothing. A repeated sequence may reveal a pattern. Someone complains, receives help, rejects the help, becomes upset, and repeats the process. That sequence is more informative than any individual sentence.
And here's the uncomfortable part. You may have your own favorite games. Perhaps you become helpless when responsibilities feel overwhelming. Perhaps you become critical when you're afraid. Perhaps you provoke arguments because emotional intensity feels more familiar than calm. Perhaps you give unsolicited advice because being needed makes you feel valuable. Perhaps you constantly apologize because it keeps other people from becoming angry. Perhaps you withdraw whenever someone gets emotionally close. The important thing is not to judge yourself. Psychological patterns usually developed for a reason. At some point, they may have helped you adapt. A child who learned to stay quiet in an unpredictable household may become an adult who avoids conflict, even when speaking up would be healthy. A child who learned that achievement earned approval may become an adult who cannot rest without feeling guilty. A child who learned that anger creates distance may become an adult who uses anger whenever vulnerability appears. The pattern can continue long after the original environment has
This is where the adult state becomes powerful. The adult can look at an old pattern without automatically obeying it. Imagine someone criticizing you. Your first reaction might be anger. Instead of immediately attacking back, you notice, I'm feeling attacked. Then you ask, what exactly did they say? Maybe the criticism is unfair. Maybe it contains useful information. Maybe both are true. You don't have to accept the criticism, but you also don't have to react automatically. This creates a pause, and the pause is where choice lives. Many psychological games depend on speed. Someone makes a provocative comment. You react. They respond. You react again. Suddenly, you're 10 minutes into an argument you never intended to have. If you slow the process down, the game can lose its momentum. Let me think about that. What exactly are you asking me? What do you mean by that? What outcome are you looking for? These are simple adult questions. They don't attack, they don't submit, they don't rescue. They bring the conversation back to reality.
Now consider relationships. One of the most destructive patterns is mind reading. Someone becomes quiet and expects their partner to understand why. The partner doesn't. Resentment grows. Eventually the person says, if you really loved me, you would know. But love doesn't automatically create telepathy. Expecting someone to guess your needs can create a game in which one person tests the other. Will they notice? Will they chase me? Will they prove they care? The other person doesn't know they're taking a test. They simply know that something feels wrong. This can create repeated disappointment. Direct communication is much harder because it requires vulnerability. I want you to spend more time with me.
I felt hurt when you canceled. I'm afraid you are becoming distant. These statements expose the real emotional need, but they also give the other person something concrete to respond to. The difference between a game and
Another relationship pattern involves testing. Someone says, "Go ahead, leave if you want." But secretly, they hope the other person will say, "No, I could never leave you." If the other person actually leaves, the first person feels betrayed. The statement was not a real invitation. It was a test. Tests can become dangerous because they create situations where the other person is expected to give the correct emotional answer without knowing the rules. The same thing happens with jealousy. Someone intentionally mentions another person's attention to provoke reassurance. Someone at work asked me out today. The hidden request might be, "Tell me I'm desirable. Tell me you still want me." But instead of asking directly, the person creates insecurity. The partner reacts with jealousy. The person receives proof that they matter. The short-term emotional reward reinforces the behavior, but the long-term relationship becomes less secure. Once you recognize the pattern, you can replace the test with the need. "I've been feeling insecure lately, and I need reassurance." That sentence may feel less dramatic.
Berne's ideas also help explain why some people seem to create the same type of relationship again and again. You might notice someone repeatedly choosing partners who are emotionally unavailable. Another person repeatedly ends up in relationships where they feel responsible for everything. Someone else constantly finds themselves in relationships where they are criticized. It can be tempting to say they have terrible luck, but patterns deserve closer attention. People often select environments that feel psychologically familiar, even when those environments are unhealthy. Familiar doesn't mean comfortable. It simply means recognizable. If someone grew up believing love must be earned, they may unconsciously feel drawn to relationships where they have to prove themselves. If someone learned that being needed equals being loved, they may choose people who require rescuing. If someone learned that emotional distance is normal, intimacy may feel threatening. This doesn't mean people consciously choose suffering. It means the nervous system can confuse familiarity with safety. Recognizing the pattern creates the possibility of choosing differently. The question becomes, what feels familiar to me, and is it actually healthy? This is also why personal growth can feel uncomfortable. When you stop playing an old game, other people may react. Imagine you've always been the person who solves everyone's problems. One day you say, "I trust you to handle this." The other person may become angry. "You don't care anymore. You're different. You used to help me." You may feel guilty. But guilt doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional signal that you're breaking an old pattern. The relationship had an established transaction. You played the rescuer, they played the dependent role. When you change your behavior, the old system becomes unstable. That doesn't mean you should abandon people. It means support can become healthier. "I care about you, but I can't make this decision for you. I'll help you think through the options, but the final choice is yours." These statements preserve connection without taking responsibility for another person's life. Healthy relationships don't require one person to remain helpless so the other can remain. Now think about criticism. There's a difference between constructive feedback and a psychological game built around blame. Constructive feedback focuses on behavior and outcomes. The report was submitted late, and we need a better process. A game may focus on identity. You're always irresponsible. The first statement creates an opportunity for action. The second creates defensiveness. When you hear criticism, ask yourself, is this person giving me information, or are we entering a familiar emotional pattern? Sometimes the answer will be both. You can take the useful information without accepting the attack. This is another adult skill. You don't have to choose between total submission and total rebellion. You can separate the message from the emotional packaging. The deadline was missed. I'll address that. You don't have to accept you're incompetent. This distinction can dramatically improve workplace communication. It can also protect your self-esteem.
Because if you interpret every criticism as a statement about your identity, you will either become defensive or collapse. If you treat feedback as information, you can evaluate it. One of the most interesting consequences of Berne's theory is that it changes how you listen. Instead of listening only to words, you start noticing patterns. What happens immediately after the complaint? What response seems to be expected? What role does each person repeatedly occupy? Does someone always become the victim? Does someone always become the rescuer? Does an argument always end with the same person apologizing? Does a particular topic repeatedly trigger the same emotional reaction? These patterns are clues, and once you see them, you don't have to participate. Imagine someone says, "Nobody ever helps me." Your instinct might be to prove that you are different. You offer help. They reject it. You offer another solution. They reject that too. Instead, you might say, "It sounds like you're having a difficult time. What kind of help would actually be useful?" Now the responsibility returns to them. Or imagine someone repeatedly criticizes you. Instead of defending every accusation, you can ask, "What specific behavior would you like me to change?" Suddenly, vague criticism has to become concrete. Games often survive in ambiguity. Clarity can interrupt them.
This doesn't mean every difficult interaction is a psychological game. People have bad days. People misunderstand each other. People become emotional. Not every argument hides a secret motive. Berne's framework is most useful as a lens, not as a weapon. If you start labeling everyone around you as manipulative, you've simply created another game. The goal is self-awareness, not superiority. You don't want to become the person who says, "I understand psychology, so I can see through everyone." That attitude can itself become a parent position, where you judge other people from above. The healthier approach is curiosity. What is happening here? What am I contributing? What do I actually want? What does the other person actually want? And perhaps most importantly, what would a direct adult-to-adult conversation look like? That question can transform conflict. Instead of winning the argument, you try to understand the transaction. Instead of proving someone wrong, you try to discover the real issue. Instead of manipulating the outcome, you communicate your needs honestly.
There is another reason games persist. They can provide predictable emotional rewards. Even a negative pattern can become familiar enough to feel safe. Imagine someone who constantly complains about their job. Every Monday, they talk about how terrible it is. Friends listen, they receive sympathy, they promise to quit. Friday arrives, nothing changes. Monday comes again, the complaint returns. The pattern may provide attention, emotional release, and a sense of identity. I'm the person who is trapped in this terrible job. Actually changing jobs would remove the problem, but it would also remove the familiar story. Change creates uncertainty. The game creates predictability. This is why telling someone, "just leave," may not help. The issue may be deeper than the practical decision. They may need to discover what the complaint is doing for them psychologically. Does it help them avoid responsibility? Does it create connection? Does it protect them from the fear of failure in a new environment? Does it allow them to receive sympathy? Once the hidden reward is understood, the pattern becomes easier to change.
The same principle applies to our own habits. Instead of asking only, "Why do I keep doing this?" ask, "What do I get from doing this?" The answer may surprise you. Maybe procrastination protects you from the possibility of failing. Maybe perfectionism protects you from criticism. Maybe anger protects you from feeling hurt. Maybe people-pleasing protects you from rejection. Maybe staying stuck protects you from having to make a frightening decision. A behavior can be harmful and still serve a psychological function. If you remove the behavior without replacing the function, the pattern may return. Imagine someone who constantly seeks approval. They decide to stop asking everyone what they think, but now they feel anxious and isolated. They haven't learned how to reassure themselves. The old behavior was providing emotional security. A healthier approach would be to build internal confidence while gradually reducing the dependence on external approval. This is why awareness must be combined with new behavior. Understanding the game is the beginning. Practicing a different response is what changes the pattern.
Let's bring this into everyday life. Someone sends you a message that feels passive-aggressive. Your first impulse is to respond immediately with equal hostility. Stop. Ask yourself, what do I actually know? Maybe the message was poorly written. Maybe they are angry. Maybe you are interpreting their tone through your own expectations. Instead of guessing, ask a clear question. Can you clarify what you mean? That single sentence can prevent an entire imaginary argument from becoming real. Or imagine a friend repeatedly canceling plans. You could accuse them, "You obviously don't care about me." Or you could say, "You've canceled several times, and I'm starting to feel that our plans aren't a priority. Is there something going on?" The second approach is vulnerable, but it gives the other person an opportunity to respond honestly. Maybe they are overwhelmed. Maybe the friendship has changed. Maybe they didn't realize the impact. Maybe they don't want the relationship anymore. None of those answers is necessarily comfortable, but clarity is better than living inside assumptions. This is one of the deepest lessons of psychological awareness. Clarity can hurt, but confusion can trap you. Games often survive because both people avoid saying what is actually happening. They hint, they test, they accuse, they withdraw, they provoke, they rescue, they apologize. But they don't directly communicate the underlying need. Direct communication feels risky because the answer may not be what you want. If you ask someone directly for affection, they might say no. If you ask directly whether they want the relationship, they might say no. If you ask directly whether your work is valued, you might hear something uncomfortable. So the game becomes a way to delay the truth. But delaying the truth doesn't change it. It only makes the emotional path longer. Now consider the parent voice inside your own head. It may say, "You should be further ahead by now. You should never make mistakes. You must keep everyone happy. You should work harder. You shouldn't feel this way." These statements can sound like motivation, but sometimes they create chronic pressure. The adult can challenge them. According to whom? Is this expectation realistic? What evidence supports it? Would I speak this way to someone I care about? This doesn't mean removing standards. Healthy standards are useful. The question is whether your internal parent is supportive or relentlessly critical. A person can become their own psychological persecutor. Every mistake becomes evidence of inadequacy. Every achievement becomes insufficient. Rest becomes guilt. Success becomes temporary. The adult can introduce a more balanced perspective. I made a mistake. What can I learn? I'm tired. What do I need? This goal matters to me, but I don't have to destroy myself to reach it. The difference may sound small. Psychologically, it can be enormous. And the child inside you also deserves attention. Adults sometimes become so focused on being responsible that they lose access to curiosity and joy. Everything becomes productivity. Every activity needs a purpose. Every hour must be optimized. But the healthy child contains spontaneity. It can enjoy something without turning it into an achievement. It can laugh without needing a reason. It can explore without knowing where the exploration will lead. This part of Berne's framework is important because psychological maturity is not about becoming permanently serious. The goal is integration. You need the adult to make decisions. You need healthy parent values to provide guidance. And you need the child's emotional and creative energy. Problems arise when one state dominates everything. An overly controlling parent can suppress spontaneity. An impulsive child can make decisions without considering consequences. A disconnected adult can become cold and detached. Balance allows the different parts to contribute without taking over. You can be responsible without becoming rigid, emotional without becoming controlled by emotion, playful without becoming irresponsible. This gives us a practical way to think about personal growth. The goal isn't to eliminate your parent or child. It's to become more aware of when each is operating. Your parent can tell you what you've learned.
Your child can tell you what you feel. Your adult can evaluate what is true right now. Imagine you were offered a new job. Your parent says, a stable career is safer. Your child says, I want something exciting. Your adult asks, what are the salary, risks, growth opportunities, responsibilities, and long-term consequences? Now all three perspectives have information to contribute. The adult doesn't silence the others, it integrates them. This is a powerful way to make decisions, because many bad decisions happen when one state takes complete control. Pure fear can make you reject opportunities. Pure excitement can make you ignore risk. Pure social conditioning can make you follow a path you don't actually want. Integration creates a more complete picture. And this is where Berne's model becomes more than a theory about conversations. It becomes a framework for understanding yourself.
Now, imagine using this framework for 1 week. Don't try to analyze everyone. Analyze yourself. Notice moments when you feel suddenly small, defensive, superior, helpless, rebellious, or desperate for approval. Those emotional shifts are clues. Ask what happened immediately before them. What did someone say? What did you assume it meant? Which psychological position did you enter? Did you become the critic, the victim, the rescuer, the rebellious child, the frightened child, the controlling parent? Then ask the most important question. What would the adult response have been? Maybe it would have been to ask for clarification, maybe to set a boundary, maybe to apologize, maybe to say no, maybe to stop giving advice, maybe to accept responsibility, maybe to walk away. You don't need to become perfect. You simply...
And that may be the real freedom Berne's ideas offer. Not freedom from difficult people. You cannot control everyone around you. Not freedom from emotion. Emotion is part of being human. Not freedom from conflict. Conflict is unavoidable. The freedom isn't becoming less automatic. You begin to notice when someone is inviting you into a familiar pattern. You don't have to accept the invitation. Someone criticizes you. You don't have to become defensive. Someone acts helpless. You don't have to rescue them. Someone tries to provoke jealousy. You don't have to take the test. Someone demands that you prove your love. You can communicate directly. Someone blames you for... Think about how many hours people spend trying to win conversations that were never designed to be won. They defend themselves against accusations. They explain themselves repeatedly. They try to prove their intentions. They attempt to make someone understand. They seek the perfect sentence that will finally change the other person's mind. But some interactions are circular. The same accusation returns, the same defense returns, the same emotional ending returns. If you recognize that pattern, your next move may be different. Instead of explaining more, you can say, I don't think we're solving anything this way. Let's pause. Or, I'm willing to discuss the specific issue, but not continue with personal attacks. Boundaries are not another form of punishment. They are a way of defining what kind of interaction you are willing to participate in. And this is where psychological maturity becomes practical. You cannot always choose what other people say, but you can choose what you respond to. You can choose what you explain. You can choose what you refuse to debate. You can choose whether to rescue. You can choose whether to react.
There is one final trap to watch for: using psychological knowledge to manipulate people more effectively. Once you understand games, you might become fascinated by them. You may start looking for hidden motives everywhere. You may think, I know exactly what they're doing. But that can become another game. The purpose of psychological awareness is not to become better at controlling people. It is to become harder to control and more honest in your own interactions. If you know someone wants reassurance, give reassurance when appropriate instead of exploiting their insecurity. If you recognize someone is seeking attention through conflict, you don't need to punish them. You can respond calmly. If you notice someone is stuck in a victim role,
You can support their agency rather than taking over their life. Psychology becomes powerful when it creates understanding rather than superiority. And perhaps the most important person to analyze is not the person across the table. It is yourself. What games do you play? What emotional rewards do they provide? What would happen if you stopped? Imagine a relationship where nobody has to guess what the other person means. A workplace where problems are discussed without humiliation. A friendship where people can ask directly for support instead of creating drama. A family where adults can disagree without turning every disagreement into an old childhood conflict. A person who can receive criticism without collapsing and receive praise without becoming dependent on it. That may sound idealistic, but every healthier interaction begins with one small change: awareness. Notice the transaction. Notice the role. Notice the emotional shift. Then choose. You don't have to respond exactly as you always have. And sometimes the smallest sentence can break an entire pattern. What do you need from me? What are you asking me to decide? Is this about what happened today or something older? Would you like advice or would you like me to listen? What part of this is actually my responsibility? What would you like to happen next? These questions bring hidden assumptions into the open. Once they're visible, you can negotiate them. And when people can negotiate openly, they have less need for psychological games. So the next time you find yourself in an argument that feels strangely familiar, stop and ask yourself one question. Have we had this conversation before, even if the details are different? Maybe you've had the same fight with different people. Maybe you've played the same role in different relationships. Maybe you've repeatedly become the rescuer, the critic, the victim, the apologizer, or the person who walks away. If the pattern follows you, it may be worth looking inward. Not with shame, with curiosity. Because your repeated role may be telling you something about what you learned to expect from relationships. And once you understand that expectation, you can question it. You can decide whether you still want it. You can build a different pattern. That is the deeper lesson behind games people play. Human behavior can become repetitive without becoming inevitable. A pattern can be learned, reinforced, and repeated, but it can also be observed, interrupted, and replaced. You are not required to keep playing a game simply because you have played it for years. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is this: every interaction gives you a choice. You can react automatically, or you can become aware. You can criticize, or you can clarify. You can rescue, or you can empower. You can test someone, or you can ask directly. You can blame, or you can identify your responsibility. You can hide behind anger, or you can admit that you are hurt. You can demand that someone understand you, or you can explain what you need. And you can continue playing the familiar game, or you can step out of it. The goal is not to become emotionless. It is not to analyze every sentence people say. It is not to treat relationships like psychological experiments. The goal is much simpler. Become aware enough to notice when an old pattern is taking over. Then bring yourself back to the present. Ask what is actually happening. Ask what you genuinely need. Ask what belongs to you and what belongs to the other person. And respond from the adult state rather than automatically repeating the past. Because the most important game you can stop playing is the game where you keep living according to an old script that no longer serves you. You don't have to win every argument. You don't have to prove your worth. You don't have to rescue everyone. You don't have to make everyone happy. You don't have to participate in every emotional battle. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply to recognize the pattern and choose something different. That is where genuine psychological freedom begins. If this book gave you a new way to understand yourself and the people around you, subscribe for more psychology and self-development book summaries. Because the more clearly you understand human behavior, the more consciously you can choose your own.